Sing to me, oh Muse. The Odyssey, an original adaptation written and retold for you by Jon Buckeridge. Chapter 16. The Contest. The Festival of Apollo was always a lavish event. It happened around the harvest time, and Apollo being the god of light and music and poetry, it was always a good one. There were games and songs and poets and bards, and it always finished off with a massive blowout feast. In the great hall of Ithaca, the feast was drawing to a close. There had been 2 whole cows, 4 pigs, 3 sheep, 3 goats, and all of it had been roasted to perfection. Everyone had eaten and drunk to their heart's content, and they were now mopping up the last bits of gravy with fresh baked bread. A wonderfully contented murmuring of conversation filled the hall. Odysseus watched it all from the sidelines where the beggars sat, and waited for his moment. For Penelope, it had not been a merry time. She had not eaten a single bite, and her mind just kept racing over and over. "Oh, merciful Zeus, please give me a good husband. Glowing Apollo, please look down on this contest with favour," she prayed. Jangling all over with nerves, she knew she could not delay any longer. "Time to get this over with," she thought, and she rose from her seat. A quiet fell on the hall. "Gentlemen," she said with as much calm as she could muster, "you have waited 4 years for me to choose a husband from among you, and today that time has come." She clapped her hands, and the doors opened. Through them came the hulking form of Eumaeus, carrying Odysseus's mighty bow with both hands. Behind him came several servants. They carried a ship's mast across their shoulders. Into that mast were driven 12 axe heads, their blades buried deep in the timber. None of the axes had handles, so there were gaping holes where the shafts should have been. The holes were all lined up, so if you stood in just the right place and squinted through them, you could see all of the 12 as if they were one. An expectant silence filled the room. "This is a feat of strength and skill my husband Odysseus used to perform," Penelope went on. "Standing at the far end of this very hall, he would fire a single arrow through all 12 of these axe heads and out of the other side. If any man here can string his bow and perform the same feat, I will count him worthy to take his place. Good luck." She stepped back and waited to see who would go first. But the man who stepped forward took everyone by surprise. It was Telemachus. Immediately there were jeers from all the suitors. "You can't take up the challenge," they yelled. "Are you going to marry your mother?" Telemachus waited in silence until their shouts died down. "Gentlemen, this challenge is to see who can take my father's place," he began. "Well, who better than his son? If I can string his bow and complete this challenge, then I will take the throne of Ithaca, and my mother shall be free from your advances." Once again, the suitors leapt up with angry voices. "You can't take the throne," one cried. "You're not yet of age." From his place in the corner, Odysseus saw several meaningful glances exchanged, and 1 or 2 hands drifted towards knives in their belts. But then Antinous stepped forward, his hands outstretched. Gentlemen, he said. "If Prince Telemachus believes he is old enough and man enough to take up this challenge, then we shall let him. And who knows, if he succeeds, then he may still need our help and guidance along the way. And we shall be very hands-on with our guidance." He flashed his perfect teeth in a perfect smile, but his eyes were dark, and Odysseus saw several men around the room exchanging similar glances. But they stayed silent, and Telemachus took up the bow. He held it with reverence. He gave a heave on one end and tried to bend the limb, but it would not budge. He heaved again, putting all his might and weight on it, but still nothing. He gave another try, but the bow stayed straight. He looked at it very carefully. He examined the length, saw where it curved and where it wanted to move, and Odysseus could see in his eyes that he was working something out. All of a sudden, Telemachus's face lit up, and understanding blossomed on it. He placed one end of the bow on the floor and steadied it with his foot. As he pulled again, the bow gave the most minute twitch. But at the other end of the room, Odysseus gave a tiny shake of his head, and Telemachus let go. "No," he told the crowd, "It seems I am not yet ready to take my father's place." And he walked away. One by one, the suitors stepped forward to give the task a try. They took the great bow in their hands and tried to bend it to set the string in place, but none could do it. A few of the bigger ones managed to make the ends twitch a little bit, but not one of them could bend it enough to attach a string, let alone knock an arrow and draw the bow back. One man heaved so hard that he threw his back out and was now lying out very flat in the corner, feeling sorry for himself. One other man never even got to try bending the bow because he tripped on his way up the steps and concussed himself. He was now sitting against the wall looking somewhat worse for wear. Gradually, the list of suitors dwindled to just Antinous. Antinous stepped up. "This is your moment," he told himself. "This is where you claim everything you wanted." He took the bow in his hands and weighed it carefully, running the limbs between his fingers and trying to see where was best to pull. "Here we go," he thought, and he put a hand at each end and pulled. There was no movement. Undeterred, he changed his grip and tried again. "It just won't move," he thought, and however he heaved and hauled, the bow would not budge. He wrenched and strained and spat and swore and gave everything he could muster to the task, but however hard he strained, the bow stubbornly refused to move. Eventually, he threw it to the ground and cried out in frustration. "This is foolishness," he yelled. "Odysseus never managed this task. No one did. No one can. This is another one of your tricks to delay us, Penelope, and we're not falling for it. No more delays. Here and now, once and for all, you're going to choose one of us to be your husband." He expected Penelope to be staring at him, possibly with a look of guilt and resignation on her gaze, but instead she was looking over his shoulder, her mouth slightly open. Turning, he saw the old beggar had picked up the discarded bow and was holding it in his hands like it was an old friend. "Put the bow down, old man," he hissed to the beggar. "It's not for you." The beggar ignored him, though. "That old man is so rude," Antinous thought. "I ought to teach him a lesson." But the tramp just kept staring at the bow. "There's a trick to it," he said, though his voice didn't seem to creak any more. He set one end of the bow on the floor and held it in place with his foot. Then he pushed at it with his knee and his hip all at once, and the bow bent gracefully down. Effortlessly, he looped a bowstring around each end and plucked it just once. There was a low, thrumming note that echoed through the silent hall, and the suitors watched, open-mouthed, as he chose an arrow from the quiver, drew the bow smoothly back to his cheek, sighted along the shaft, and loosed. The whole action had taken less than a heartbeat, but the arrow sped forward, slicing through the air and passing perfectly through each of the 12 axe heads, thudding to a stop in the wall on the opposite side. The hall echoed with the sound of the vibrating arrow as everyone stared at the man. There was no sound, no one spoke. They just stared from the man to the arrow and back again. Eventually, Penelope broke the silence. "Well, stranger, I suppose we ought to know your name." But Antinous had heard enough. "That doesn't count," he cried. "That does not count." He strode into the centre of the room and glared at the men around the walls. "He can't just turn up here and jump the queue. He's not one of us. And how do we know this isn't another of Penelope's plots to hold us off, the duplicitous little witch?" "You'd be wise not to talk of the woman of this house in that way," said the beggar to Antinous, and there was definitely no creak to his voice now, but Antinous was too angry to notice. "Oh, shut up, you old tramp, and go back where you came from," he replied. "You're not marrying her, and that's final. We've been waiting 4 years for this woman." Quicker than a blink, the old man had another arrow knocked and pointed right at Antinous' throat. "I've been waiting for her a lot longer than that," he said, and let the arrow fly.